I'd like to share some things that I invite you to think about in terms of where to move. I've been sitting on this for quite some time, but I think now's the time to share this. It's not like anything in this is a big secret. Well, maybe one thing, but I'm not going to talk much about that. Um, it's just that I'm not sure that anyone sort of laid this out. So I'm going to give it a shot, and then you'll have the information. And on that note, we'll start from the bottom up on this slide. I'm not advising anybody to do anything crazy here. I think that you should always have reasons for what you do, and in this case, some of those reasons will pertain to the timing and what sorts of the intensity of the measures that you'll take to get to wherever it is that you want to go. The point of all of this, in my opinion, is that it's part of how we seek the Lord. He expects us to live up to the information that we have. Too often we morph this into some sort of a caricature of what happened in times like Noah's day, when we oversimplify the idea of what a prophet is and reduce the portion of reason in what they say. Noah is not the easiest example to use for that as far as the scriptures go, because we have so little about the events of his time and the reasons people had to see him for who he was, and they did have abundant reasons. I don't want to get too much into that, but that's has to do with the curse that was on the land and how he helped to bring about alleviation from those conditions. He was well known to the world back then and for the value that he had in relation to all that. But if we want to stick to what's in the scriptures, we do have information on Moses. And Moses had a lot of reasons, or rather the people had a lot of reasons to believe Moses. Even the first time he tried to free them, resulting in him having to flee from Egypt, he was well known by the entire nation as a very high-ranking member of Pharaoh's family, having won many military victories and so on. They had every reason to believe that he knew what he was talking about and he was capable of doing what he intended to do. Anyway, so in this presentation, I'm just going to share some reasons. Instead of just sharing with you my conclusions about where I think are good places, I'm going to tell you why I think that in terms that you can understand. And then you can take that information to make your own decisions. But at that point, it doesn't really matter who you heard it from. In all of this, I hope that your motive, as mine is not so much to reduce your own suffering, but rather to maximize your service to the Lord. And that should be our focus with everything. Okay, so there's your preamble, your disclaimer. Let's start with what I call general properties. The most important thing that you can look for in where to live, in my opinion, is a low population density. And each of these factors, you get to weigh how important they are to you. You get to think about, we're going to talk about some potential events that would cause you to want to live in a different place when they happen. Of course, it'll be too late to do much about it at that point. But to help fill out this picture, we need to think about different properties. Population density serves as a filter, just like the other properties that we'll look at, because so many things could happen that would cause you to wish you lived in a place with fewer people. What could these be? One thing I don't talk about in this presentation is a famine or an epidemic, a real dangerous disease. Well, whatever the trigger might be, the catalyst, there are many things that will cause you to want to live in a low population area. And when you apply that filter, you'll see on this graph, for instance, you kind of just want to live in the places with white squares. Maybe with where it starts turning yellow, but definitely not in any areas that are blue. And so this, if you overlaid this, or rather, if you thought about this, and well, I'm saying this in a way that's more complicated than it needs to be. This is a population density graph. Therefore, the places where most people live are the places where most people live. And so probabilistically, this filter is great because no matter where you live, the odds are high it's a place where you shouldn't. So you want to get to a place where very few people live. And if that's all you do, then you're ahead of the game, because that is an optimal move for a wide variety of potential situations. That's one way to make a good choice, is that you don't hyper-focus on the need to be right about exactly what you think is going to happen or when, but you can put them in a basket. You put the events in a basket and the timelines in a wide range. You say, well, I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen. I'm not exactly sure when it's going to happen. But looking, if I can extract similar properties out of a cluster of potential outcomes, then if I take a choice that would be a pretty good choice given a whole range of potential outcomes, then that's much more likely to benefit you than one that, say, would only be optimal if a very specific thing happened at a very specific time. It's really hard to correctly predict specific events and times. But if you have a range of times and a range of events, it becomes easier. And if those events point in the same direction, your confidence can go up that you're making a good decision. Another thing to think about in general is elevation. Temperature and rainfall can also be important, but I've left those out because those are more specific to growing food. And that has a place in this presentation, but it's not until at the very end when we talk about survivability in inverse terms, which will be interesting. Hopefully that'll bait you to stay until the end. But elevation can be a useful thing to have. We're going to look at some specific events, but what you'll see is that things like nuclear fallout, they are less likely to affect you when you're at high elevation. Floods, things like that. And so it turns out that this is just one of many factors where there are differences depending on where you are in the country, and they can be enormous differences. Sometimes they're localized. We're going to talk just a little bit about Maine, and Maine actually has some mountainous territory in the north center of the state, but the northwestern half, we'll say, is also more elevated than towards the coast. So if something like a tidal wave occurred, your situation would be very different if you were on the coast versus more towards the interior. So with that, let's talk about threats. So if I had to arrange these by likelihood, I think the top of my list would be a grid down scenario. And this just reinforces what I told you about population density, because that is the number one thing to think about when you would want to mitigate the risk in a grid down event. So when I say grid down, that could come from any number of sources. So if a military adversary or a terrorist group set off an EMP, that could cause a grid down scenario. But a solar storm could as well. In fact, there are several different sources that might cause this. But what I'm describing is an event where the grid goes down for a sustained amount of time and it doesn't come back. And so if you want to read more about this, you can read a book by Ted Koppel called Lights Out. Very few people have read that. It's unfortunate. The information in it's great. It's nonfiction, and he uses his access to high-ranking individuals in the government and in industry to collate some grim information about the likelihood of this happening and the lack of preparation, and not just lack of preparation, but the fact that there is honestly very little that can be done to stop this or to bring electricity back once it's gone. And you could read more about that there. For the sake of brevity in this video, I won't go into it more. So if the grid went down, you would absolutely, positively want to be in a low population density area. Why? Because people will stream out of the cities looking for food and water. And it won't take that long. And they will not be happy campers. What we've seen in an unbroken chain of historic examples is in modern times is that when the basic functions available to all in society break down, so does what we falsely believe to be human decency. Humans are not decent, not naturally. And when you take away all of the abundance that gets them to play nice with others, anarchy ensues, and it can take as few as 3 days. And so you don't want to be anywhere near a city or suburbs if this happens. It's shocking how many people think that the person they think is their nice neighbor will continue to be nice when there's no food. So this is the most actionable piece of advice. Get to a place with a low population density. Again, that filters out almost all the United States. What's the next filter I would apply? The next one would be risk from a nuclear attack. Actually, I'm going to do a game time shift here. Let's make the next one nuclear plant fallout. Why would I rank that higher than nuclear warfare? Because if the grid goes down, the nuke plants will too. And that's kind of a funny thing. People don't realize this because a nuclear power plant produces electricity. But there are processes with that actually require external electricity. So if the grid goes down, so does the plant. And if that happens, the fuel rods can't be cooled and a meltdown will occur. And so if there were a nuclear meltdown, these rings indicate the areas that might be polluted due to that. Now, the downside of this graph is that it doesn't incorporate wind patterns. The wind blows basically east, and we'll see that in the chart I'm going to show you denoting the risk of nuclear war. But one interesting thing about this is that there are places in the United States that might not be proximate to a functioning or an active nuclear power plant, but decommissioned plants are also dangerous because the spent fuel rods are still there and they have to actively cool them, and if they don't, they'll melt down. So those are still a radiation risk. And as you see, this is a powerful filter because basically the entire East Coast is out. There are some exceptions. You'll see West Virginia. I'll use my mouse here. This part of West Virginia isn't in any circles, nor is, oh boy, I'm going to embarrass myself here. I think that's Kentucky. I think it's Tennessee below there, so we'll say that's Kentucky. So that one's free and clear, and that's a nice mountainous, woody area, Kentucky. Some nice backwoods places there. So as an example, you could overlay that with a population density map, and you can see that regionally speaking, there are plenty of places in the southern half of Kentucky, and certainly in West Virginia, okay? Now, you'd say, well, if we fast forward, you're going to find out I don't recommend living there. Even though I did make a video, I'm not sure when it will publish, about the possibility of living in West Virginia and some of the things you might not know about in that region. But why don't I recommend it? Well, because of the next thing, which is the risk of nuclear attack. So there are all sorts of scenarios mapped out of potential. You can apply all sorts of filters and variables for potential attack sites. You could do population centers, you could do military tactical targets, whatever. And this is actually a newer chart. It's from 2015. The ones before this were from back in the Cold War era. But basically, what you'll see here is that any population center is a potential and likely target. And then on top of that, there are military bases, and all of those would be targeted, especially the places that have silos for nuclear warheads or house the airmen. Those are Air Force units. The airmen that staff those silos. And so the cluster of those are right here, and right here. So that's North Dakota, central Montana, and southeast Wyoming. Now, what's interesting about this is that whereas the nuclear power facilities, there are some gaps here on the eastern half, in the eastern half of the United States. Between the targets and the wind, the entire eastern United States, almost entire eastern United States, is blanketed in radiation. And that's either from the bombs directly, which are going to wipe out the cities. I should say which would wipe out the cities, but also the fallout that will rain down and blow on the wind for weeks after the fact. So there are some pockets here in Pennsylvania, fewer in New York, but again, you see that Maine is wide open. Okay? So if you overlay that with the power plants, you see that the northern half of Maine is free and clear. And so Maine is the exception in the advice that I'm going to give, being the only place east of the Mississippi that I would consider a viable place. Now, with all of these potential events, if you don't think that we're ever going to get nuked, well, you just subtract that filter. And if there's something else that you can think of, like, I don't know, if you expect Lyme disease to mutate into something even worse than what it is, you could get a map of Lyme disease and say, well, I don't want to live in any of these places, right? But the approach is what I'm sharing with you here, as well as the legwork I've already done. So you take that wherever you'd like. No pun intended. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is earthquake risk. Now this is interesting because survivability is very different, earthquakes versus nuclear radiation. There's not too much you can do to hide from nuclear radiation, although you could have a bomb shelter that's secret that no one knows about in your backyard, and you could live in a relatively densely populated area and just wait it out for a month and a half and then come out and go wherever. But as far as earthquakes go, now we get into something that is going to have a lot of variability even locally in terms of how much of a problem it becomes. But then you get into the longer term effects if you survive that uninjured somehow because of population density, right? Because if you have a whole bunch of people, and if you're in a city, even if there's a big old earthquake, there will be a lot of survivors. But now they're hungry. And so what do? And there's no clean water. So these are places where you might want to worry about that. And you could overlay this filter onto the others. And the New Madrid seismic zone is really something that you should know about. If you don't, you can research that. That's going to be a big deal when it happens. And that one is a when, just like the West Coast earthquakes, like the Cascadia subduction zone. That'll create enormous tsunamis. And then you've got the San Andreas area, of course. Alaska is an interesting one. You'd think that might be a good place to set up set yourself up, but the cities tend to be right where the earthquake zones are and on the coast, which is a tsunami risk anyway. Don't go into tsunamis specifically in a graph here, because obviously if you're by a coast, even quite far inland from a coast, because the elevation map is what you need to look at, we started there, you can see that a high enough tsunami would really wreck much of the populated areas along the coasts. I don't, obviously all of the populated areas on the coast, but what I'm saying is if you actually look at simulations with different wave heights, you might be amazed at how far inland that water could go. So don't think that just because you can't see the beach, that's not something you need to worry about. Okay. Then we've got hurricanes. So we've seen in Florida this year, for example, that this isn't something you should ignore. In fact, I made a whole video about why I wouldn't live in Florida, and this is the primary reason, is the hurricane risk. There are also tornadoes. A lot of the lower cost of living areas in the center of the United States are in tornado zones. And again, similar to some of these other risks, there are things you can specifically do with your house to minimize this. I mean, if you want to make a big old concrete dome house, that's a lot stronger in terms of resisting winds from tornadoes. So these are things that might be locally mitigated, but the question is, what about the aftermath? And another reason that I put grid down so high on the list is that it is a terminal event. If something like that happened, that is the end of the world as we know it. It's not, you're not going to come back from that. It'd be what Jared Easley has called Mad Max on steroids, and I agree with that assessment. It just would never go back until and unless an awful lot of people died, and that, yeah, it would not be. But something like a tornado, obviously, that's going to be much more localized, even an earthquake, and we're not talking about the end of the world as we know it. That's just a really unfortunate thing where you and many other people might die or get injured, and or your house might get destroyed, and or all the houses around you. But, you know, it's just something to think about when you're talking about where to live. Okay, wildfire risk. It's another thing where it's regional but also localized. You can set up your own property to be pretty much immune from wildfire risk, even if you're living around a whole bunch of trees that could burn up. Things like getting a metal roof, making sure there are no trees within 200 feet of your house, things like that. So unfortunately, wildfire risk is all over the place. And it is lower on the list because there are things you can do to mitigate it that are way less expensive than trying to protect your house from tornadoes or hurricanes. But it is something to think about. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is the risk of the Yellowstone volcano erupting. It's worth talking about. Now, this is an interesting one. This graph I have here, I don't actually like it very much because it has very little. It's not integrated very well with prevailing winds. So once you input the prevailing winds, you actually see this cloud shift a lot more east in terms of the western bounds of the eruption. And essentially a great deal of the Intermountain West and Great Plains become a volcanic wasteland that where there are feet of ash on the ground. And so you can't do much with that for years to come. And then it becomes really great soil. But until then, there's not much you can do. And of course, you don't want to be anywhere near that if that were to happen. So again, I'm not saying any of these things will happen. I mean, you could express high confidence that, where's our earthquake? That eventually there will be an earthquake that's really big in the Cascadia subduction zone. Eventually there will be an earthquake that's really big in the San Andreas. Same thing with the New Madrid. But When is this going to happen? Who knows, right? These other things could happen, or maybe they won't. Or maybe they won't happen for a really long time, long after you're dead. The point is, if we expect those things to happen, so Seattle's a great example of this principle. When the city of Seattle was built, no one knew that there were 7.0 plus earthquakes there on a regular basis, geologically speaking. But now there's an enormous city there, and everyone knows that this is going to happen again. And yet they just live under the assumption it's not going to happen in their lifetimes. There's really no reason to believe that. And so that's a little crazy. We could say the same thing about the I-15 corridor in Utah. Look at the red there. Okay? So there's tons of people there, and they've never experienced, in living history, we haven't experienced a massive earthquake in these places, but we know it's going to happen. But people live their lives pretending it won't. It's quite silly. So, my recommendation is that the best place to live, generally speaking, would be somewhere within the Missouri River Basin. Now, I'm going to zoom into that quite a bit. So, here's the Missouri River Basin. And you can see it spans a bunch of very large states. But you already know from those maps that we've looked at, there's an awful lot to filter out here. Between nuclear risk, earthquake risk down in Missouri from the New Madrid, Yellowstone risk, if you add all these things up, there's really not much left. So this is hilarious, but here you have it. Now this area here, there are two areas mentioned here that are outside of this basin. One is this northeastern tip of Minnesota, which is really interesting that has just sort of stuck out through this research, but it's got a low population density. It's not within a fallout cloud. As far as I understand, there doesn't seem to be much of a reason not to live there other than the politics of the state. And basically the same thing goes with Maine. Now, I will say, I haven't looked into northeastern Minnesota, but I will say, as far as Maine goes, there's quite a bit of property there that is low cost. You can get yourself a little homestead that already has a house on it. Maybe it's older, little old farmhouse, but the prices are really low. And that was kind of surprising to me. Maybe that'll change in the near future. But for now, it seems to be kind of one of the last places that you can get a really nice place to live at a really low cost. West Virginia is another one. Now, that does not solve the problem of where to work. There are layers of all of this. But just for the sake of mentioning it, I'll mention it. And other than that, it's kind of basically the northern tip of Idaho and west of this mountain chain in western Montana. And that's kind of it. So that's not very encouraging, is it? And I think that the reality of this is something that's going to dawn on people over time. And as more and more things happen to increase the reality of the risk, people will be willing to pay a higher and higher price to get to these places. Now, again, if you go back over the filters and you say, well, I don't really think this or that is going to happen, then it does dramatically expand the square miles of places that you could go that look favorable. In case you're wondering, the reason why this green box on Idaho doesn't go further south is because that area is downwind of Spokane, and Spokane's a nuke target. It's just because of the population center. There might be some strategic element of that as well. It's basically the only city anywhere close to that area, and so it's kind of a hub. If you took that out, you'd ruin a lot of people's days. So, the interesting thing about the Missouri River Basin, excuse me, is that the Missouri River has an awful lot of tributaries, and they all flow here to Independence, Missouri. Isn't that interesting? That's the way the river flows, all the way down. So, hypothetically, if people survived the collapse of society as we know it, and they were just sort of scattered through here, all they'd have to do is follow the water, whether in a boat or on foot, and that's where they could go, is Independence. So I find that to be very interesting. And for whatever it's worth, if you're in this tip of Minnesota, you could just hop onto the Mississippi and ride that down as well. And then backtrack once you got to St. Louis. Hypothetically. So, there are also some really interesting elements about this region in terms of the density of Native Americans. There are an awful lot of Indian reservations in this area, which is also very interesting. So, here's some things to think about in terms of your specific property. Do you have a well? What is the electric cost currently, and what will it be in the future? This is something I've seen on the East Coast. The utility rates are going through the roof. I made some mention of this in the video I made about not living in Maryland. There are many places where this will be the case, that the electric costs just keep going up. What about property tax? This is a huge thing that I don't think enough people are concerned about. There is absolutely nothing stopping your county from continuously jacking up your property tax as long as there are people willing to move in and buy houses in your area. And these two things, electric cost and property tax, are certainly a problem in western Montana. So there isn't a place that's free from problems. The question is, which problems do you choose? Then there's a question of what kind of people are around you. And hopefully that helps make one of the last things we're going to talk about less offensive. You also want to worry about your ability to feed humans and animals on what you produce on your property. That's something that would be worth thinking about. And that's something that makes areas like western Montana very unattractive, because it is extremely difficult to grow food here. A place like Maine is a lot better. Now, Maine is not good farmland for anyone that lives on good farmland, because the climate is not ideal for that. It's too cold. However, compared to Montana, it's basically the Garden of Eden, because it actually rains there. And it's excruciatingly difficult to raise crops here, not just because of the cold and the short seasons, but primarily because of lack of water. So these are some things to think about when you're looking at the question of where to live. And here's the super duper offensive thing. Really what you're looking at when you're trying to figure this out is, and this is an offshoot of the the population density question. What aspects about where you live will kill the greatest number of people in the shortest time? That's a pretty brutal question, isn't it? The number one predictor of survivability is going to be how hard it is for everyone else to survive. This goes back to human nature. If there are people around you, the most likely thing is that they're going to try to kill you. And so, and that's obviously in the event of these potential emergencies. And so something that you might think would be a good thing, like the abundance of forageable food. So basically anywhere east of the Mississippi, you can just walk into the woods, and if you know what you're doing, there's plenty of food to eat. But that's not true in the Rocky Mountains. I have several books on edible plants, for example, and I was quite frustrated in getting these because I'd look through them and, out of 200 species or something, maybe one of them grows in the Rocky Mountains. And then I found a book that specifically, it was specifically about edibles of the Rocky Mountains. I think that's even what it's called. And I was excited because it was a full-length book. I said, wow, well, here are all the secrets. Come to find out, they added an awful lot to that book. It should be about 5 pages long. Everything else is just, well, this isn't really edible, but you could make a tea out of it, kind of a thing. Or this is probably poisonous and we don't recommend you eat it, but it might be edible. Anyway, so these are inverse indicators because you'd think that they would be indications of where not to live, but they're actually indications of where to live. The other one is how brutal are the winters. Basically, you want to live in the least hospitable place that you can manage, because if you can find out a way to survive there for a year after the grid goes down, 99% of the people that would cause you problems will be gone. And this is the brutal reality of the situation. Finally, another thing I would think about if I were you, and this is something you can look at regionally from a map, and also it's going to be something that requires time on the ground. How accessible are wilderness areas from where you live? So I'm not talking about, I'm from Maryland, the Baltimore region specifically. I'm not talking about a park, Patapsco State Park. I'm not talking about that. You can Google it. That's not going to be enough. If there would be 10,000 people crawling around that tiny little stand of trees, that's not a wild area. In fact, this is a wonderful filter. I didn't put this on the presentation, but you could look up wilderness areas. So it just so happens that in western Montana, there's tons and tons of wooded areas that are federal Forest Service or state land. And so they're not developed. And we actually have named wildernesses like the Bob Marshall Wilderness, Glacier National Park, okay? Places like that where if you're close enough, you can walk from your house to that place and have an extraordinarily high likelihood of never seeing another human being for as long as you want. And that's a really rare thing. It's a really rare thing. But if you lived in a place like that, you could recreationally explore those areas while the lights are still on. You could take family trips into the woods to go camping, and you could poke around and see what's there and find the water sources and become familiar with the terrain and so on. So that's an extraordinarily valuable thing if you really expect any of these things to happen. Okay? And any of these things include invasion. We haven't mentioned that one, but a foreign invasion. Questions to ask along these lines are, what kind of cover do you have? So if you live in the middle of Kansas, unless you're hiding in a stand of corn, where are you going to, how are you going to move through that terrain without being seen or heard? If you have children, have you ever been in a situation where you needed to keep them quiet? Have you ever been in a situation where they needed to stay quiet for weeks? Well, you're probably going to need a place that has some natural sound buffer so that bad people won't hear your kids from far away. We talked about forest fires, but also that mountainous terrain can help insulate you from shock waves from nuclear warheads. And that's something to think about. Trees are good. Mountains are good. Springs are good. And so if you can find these things, and here's an example of the terrain of Montana, and I'm not sure how clear this is. I don't have a legend on here, but we've got some really, really mountainous areas in this strand right here. And actually this whole area is sparsely populated in part because of the terrain. It's really hard to pop subdivisions all over the place in here. Okay, so this is the Missoula area, And this is densely populated, but once you get out into these mountain passes, it drops down to basically nothing. I'm sorry, I think this is the Missoula area. Here. It's the Bitterroot Valley. And then up north to the Flathead Lake. So an area like this, just to trace this out, these would be good places to be. Now, you don't want to be east of this mountain range because Great Falls is out here, and that's where the nukes are. And that's where the Air Force Base is. But these mountains would insulate you from all that. And there are all kinds of little pockets through here. Okay? But again, this is not an inexpensive place to live. It's very expensive. And that's unfortunate. That's a change since COVID. And I don't think it'll ever go back. So it might through various unlikely things. But anyway, I hope that gives you some ideas. Whether the specifics are useful to you or not, hopefully it helps give you a framework that you can use for your own analysis.